Hello everyone. Well, it's story time, as promised. Fortunately, no great new developments have occurred in the last 2 weeks since my previous video. I'd actually wanted to do this sooner, but, well, like far too many people, I left the hospital addicted to opiates. And I've been weaning myself off of them. And, it's been a time. It has given me a lot of empathy for some people. But I feel that I'm past the worst of it. And I don't like being addicted to things. Yeah, prided myself on not having any addictions, and this is a particularly pernicious one, so although it's unpleasant, I'm glad to be ridding myself of it. So, I suppose the most important story, the primary one, is the story of my cancer. And, you know, there's a very broad overview in the GoFundMe, but of course there's a lot more to it than that. So I'm going to break it into two parts, because it's a story with a number of chapters. And we'll do part one today. So I hope you find it, I don't know, at least interesting. We shall begin at the beginning. In early 2015, something happened in my life that was certainly one of the most personally devastating experiences I've ever had. Fast forward to 2019, and I had moved from Victoria to the Kootenays about 8 months previous to the events in question. And Nelson was a bust, so I moved to Rossland. For those of you unfamiliar, it's a small mountain town, the 8th highest in Canada, about an hour's drive southwest of Nelson. 4 days after arriving in Rossland, I got a case of what seemed to be food poisoning, and probably was. But I didn't get better. I spent about 3 weeks with really terrible digestive upset. And I didn't, you know, think too much of it. My digestion's always been sensitive, and, well, you know, the stress of the move and all that. But it really didn't get better, and I started getting worse, and I checked myself into the hospital on April 19th, 2019. And the docs figured it was a Crohn's flare-up and treated it accordingly, and I did feel better due to the massive doses of steroids I was given. So I went home after about 3 days in the hospital. A day and a half later, during the night, I developed a total bowel obstruction. If you've had one of those, you know what it's like. 1 out of 10. Would not recommend as an experience. Very painful, and increasingly so as time goes on. But probably the worst is just the sense of wrongness. Like, my intestines were trying so hard to move what was in there, and it just wasn't. And I knew the signs of severe bowel obstruction, mainly dry heaving. So when that started happening, I called the ambulance for myself, because couldn't drive. And went to the hospital again. This was the 23rd of April. Later that day, I had emergency open abdominal surgery to remove whatever was obstructing my large intestine. So that's a major surgery. And I'll get into the aftermath of that shortly. So a few days later, my doc, one of the most displays of Western medicine that I've had, and I've had a few, comes into my room and he says, so your blood test results are looking good, your hemoglobin's coming up. Let's see, I think we could maybe start you back on clear fluids in a couple days. Yeah, that thing obstructing your bowels was cancer. And I think I'll order another blood test for tomorrow. And in the meantime, just call the nurse if you need anything. Bye. That's how I found out I had cancer. So I call that my double brush with death, that experience, because I had the acute of a bowel obstruction, which if they rupture, which they certainly can, will obviously kill you. And then the diagnosis of something that very often kills people. So it was a very traumatic time, and super grateful for somatic-based counseling, which really helped get me out of the sort of shell shock I was in after that experience. Plus the practices that I'm fortunate enough to carry. So it was about 6 weeks of physical recovery from that surgery before I was basically mobile enough and in enough not pain to live independently. And I slowly went back to work and carried on. Decided not to do chemotherapy at that point, mostly because I was just a wreck and didn't feel up to it. And wanted to see if, things would be okay after this. Well, they weren't. At my 6-month out screening, that October and November, it was discovered that there was a local recurrence. So more cancer growing right near the site of the original tumor. Oh, it was colorectal cancer, stage 3, T4N1M0, for those of you who know what that means. Local recurrence. So that was a blow. And I went to see a surgeon who specializes in colorectal cancer down in Vancouver, Carl Brown. And during that consultation, it was recommended that the entirety of my lower digestive tract be removed. That being my colon, my rectum, and on downwards. Because it seemed that from my years of Crohn's disease, my colon was basically just a great mass of scar tissue and wasn't really doing its job, and the only thing it was doing was being a really great breeding ground for cancer cells. Because apparently tissue like that is. So it was recommended that everything come out, and it would be another open abdominal surgery. And it would leave me with a permanent ostomy, irreversible for the rest of my life, barring great advances in science. For those of you who are unacquainted, an ostomy is a poop bag. Basically, a section of your intestine comes out through the front of your abdomen into a bag that has a opening on the bottom so you can empty it. So I have one of those, and have for a couple years, because I went through with that surgery. I found Doc Brown's argument persuasive. And in January of 2020, right before coronavirus, went down to Vancouver and had a planned, non-emergency open abdominal surgery, which was so much easier to recover from than the first emergency one. So I recovered from that, went back home, and started rebuilding my life. Then I got a call from the wonderful Paul Klimo, an oncologist in Vancouver, and the person who told me when my cancer probably began growing back in 2015. And so I had my surgery end of January, so Paul Klimo called me up in April. And he said, I was wondering if you made a decision about that surgery. I was like, I had it 3 months ago. And he was like, oh, I'd better find that report. So he calls me up, and now I figure I'm done, right? I'm all good. Cancer's not going to come back. I can rebuild my life. Everything's okay. Start putting it all behind me. So he calls me up a few days later, and he says, the margins were very narrow on that surgery. And what that means is usually when they cut out cancer, they like to cut out a decent amount of healthy tissue around it, leaving a good margin, just in case there's a bit of infiltration. Narrow margins means they weren't able to cut enough healthy tissue to make sure the cancer hadn't been in whatever was left. So he said, I recommend you do a course of chemotherapy because you could have cancer spreading through your body right now. And if you were my son, I would tell you to do this. I darn near lost consciousness. Total trauma trigger response. So suddenly I was right back in it all and had a big decision to make. And that is where we will pick up with part 2. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks for your ongoing support, emotionally, financially, and otherwise. And I'll be back again soon with the rest of the story and a few more.